Welcome to the Sharing the Faith podcast, where every other week we explore the beauty and power of faith in Jesus Christ, the light of the world. Now here is your host, Dr. Tom Neal.
Well, hello, everyone. Dr. Tom Neal here. It's good to have you here. This is an edition of Sharing the Faith. This is actually the first in a new series of Sharing the Faith, which I call Sharing the Faith with Priests, for the priests of our diocese in Pensacola-Tallahassee. This series will be an opportunity for me to bring people on who share their wisdom on priestly ministry, various aspects of priestly ministry. And today, I'm thrilled to begin this with a dear friend of mine for years, whom I've had on the show before for Sharing the Faith, to talk about homiletics. And that is Father Jim Schmitmeyer, who is coming to us from a school somewhere in northern Texas. Father Jim, good morning. It's good to be with you. Where exactly are you?
It's good to be with you. Well, I'm in Valley School, which is a small rural school between the towns of Turkey and Kittiquay. And I'm here because generally the internet service in this part of the country isn't very good, but the school has a good connection.
Excellent. We're so happy to have you here. So Father is a retired priest of the Diocese of Amarillo. And in his retirement, he is very active. He is involved in prison ministry, in ministry to recovering addicts. And he also right now is teaching a course on homiletics to the permanent diaconate candidates in the Diocese of Amarillo. So, and among other things that he does as well, Father is going to share today his own wisdom and experience, education, and his teaching wisdom on homiletics. So, Father, I want to dive right into the first question to kind of get into this topic of preaching, which is the Second Vatican Council, of course, put a whole fresh impetus into the work of preaching with a new focus. And the decree on the life and ministry of the priest, I know it lists preaching as the chief duty of the priest, which is really a striking comment to make, by the way. So you've been a homilist for 40 years. What would you say the main impact of preaching has been on your own ministry?
Well, for me, I've always have really treasured this role of being a homilist, and actually the term homilist has a different connotation than that of being a preacher. And I think when most people think of preaching, including a lot of priests, they think of preaching as teaching, and it is a form of teaching, but because it takes place within the context of the liturgy, it has its own feel and style and format, you might say. So for me, being a preacher is more like being a poet than being a teacher, because at the heart of homiletic preaching is a deep connection to your people, a deep love for them. The pastor is normally the person who gives the homily because of his close connection with his people. He's with them in good times and in difficult times, and knows their, he knows what's beneath the magnets in the refrigerator doors because he visits people. He hears about what goes on at work and in the lunchroom, and it's this privileged access to the lives of his people that he draws upon to help them discover and see the presence of God in the ups and downs of their day-to-day life. And so for me, I say being a poet or adopting that mindset helps me realize that my job isn't so much to expound the scriptures, but to interweave the scriptures, the stories of God, with the stories of their lives. And so I'm looking for the words that oftentimes are just beyond reach. You look into the deep places of the heart, and then you try to find the words that describe what goes on there, and to describe them in the light of our faith and the presence of the Spirit.
Yes. And I know just before the show, we were exchanging about a conversation you had with an Assemblies of God pastor, which I thought was a fascinating observation.
Yes, he was relating to me. We've been in conversation kind of about spiritual matters and things like writing, and we share some books once in a while. But he mentioned to me not long ago that he was really struck by how much from the Catholic corner of the room narrative is stressed. In his upbringing, the idea of the gospel being a story, that we were part of a story, just never, ever entered into the conversation. And he said it never entered into his mind. It was always pretty much black and white. You do this, God says this, you respond this way. And more of a, the Bible was more of a manual than an epic.
Wow.
More of a how-to book rather than an adventure story. And so he just found that fascinating, and he's kind of exploring what that all means.
That is so fascinating. And, obviously for the vast majority of Protestants, at least in the Deep South, the centerpiece of their liturgy is the Word. And so, I mean, and I've been to many Protestant worship services over the years, and the preaching can be very enriching. It is powerful, but they don't have the liturgy of the Eucharist. They don't have the Eucharist. But thinking of how much they're able to feed their people with the Word just makes me realize how important it is in our liturgy for the priest to really grasp that the proclamation of the Word and the breaking open of the bread of the Word really is a kind of feeding of the people.
Right, and also. We have that wonderful story of Emmaus, and what's fascinating about that story, many fascinating things about that story, especially for the homilist. When Jesus is walking with the disciples who are downcast, they don't recognize him, and the text says that he explains the scriptures to them. But that word "explains" could probably more accurately be translated as "unfolds," and he's unfolding God's story, and his part in that story, and their part in his story, and God's story. And so that when the bread is finally broken at the table, they don't say, "Oh, we understand now. Okay, we see what you want us to do." Rather, what do they say? "We're not our hearts burning." They recognize him. And so the type of preaching that takes place within the context of the liturgy, in my opinion, and this is backed up especially by the document that came out a number of years ago now, fulfilled in your hearing by the U.S. Catholic bishops, the homily in the Sunday Assembly. The purpose of the homily is to engender an encounter with Christ. It's not to teach. It's to bring people to worship, in effect, the homily is the communion service of the liturgy of the Word. Our liturgy has two parts: the liturgy of the Word, the liturgy of the Eucharist. Each one has its own communion service. And the homily is to be the communion service, so that people leave church knowing that they have encountered the living Word of God, not an abstract teaching, but more like that fragrant bread. And they leave saying, we just had this amazing conversation with Christ on some deep level. In fact, a lot of folks, if you were to ask them, I asked a priest friend of mine this not too long ago. I said, do you know what the word homily means in Greek? And automatically he said, it means instruction. I said, no. It means conversation. The word homily is Greek for conversation. And it's based on the fact that the pastor has these conversations with his people and then brings them into conversation with the Lord. It's a very rich concept and one that I just find thrilling. It's kept my eyes peeled for Christ.
Well, so that is really, that's remarkable, by the way. I don't know if I've grasped that before so clearly from that etymology of homiletics. So, priests, I've known so many priests over the years, and many of them have shared with me the experience of preaching. Like a lot of priests, I'll say to them, what's preaching like for you? A lot of new priests, I'll say that. And I'll ask them what preparation is like, and then delivery is like, and the variety of, people's approaches to preparing and to delivering is immense. But if there, as you teach this, are there foundations that undergird, all the different styles of delivery and preparation and all of that, or maybe just give some foundations there that would be helpful.
Yeah, style is based on form. think of and the form depends on where you are and what's happening. Think about a football coach. When he's recruiting, he's going to be talking to those young guys in a particular way, building them up, trying to draw them in. But then, of course, later on the practice field, he's going to be talking a whole different way, and he's going to be directing them, giving them real clear instructions. And actually, that corresponds to evangelization. You're drawing people in. Coaching, practice. That's catechesis. That has to do with action. Once you accept the gospel, does my life match what I believe? And then, of course, after the games, there's the there's the analysis. You watch the replays, and then you think, okay, how can we do this better next time? But the emphasis isn't so much on the action, on throwing the pass and running the ball. It's on thinking it through. And that's a third type of preaching. Traditionally, there are these 4 different genres of preaching: evangelization, catechesis, and this one is called theological argument. And it has to do with figuring out how to think about life from the perspective of God's revelation, tradition, the teaching of the church, all of that. So that has to do with analysis. And then we finally come to homiletic, which that's game night. Things are happening, and there's enthusiasm, and there's all kinds of encouragement, and the coaches say, "Look here, look at that, and what about this? And you're doing a good job. It's let's hang in there." It's the actual encounter with the Spirit. Or another way of looking at this, Tom, maybe a little clearer, is to use the analogy of a lens. Evangelization gives people a general lens through which to view their life, to discover its meaning and its purpose. And that lens, of course, is the death and resurrection of the Lord. After they accept that, the next logical type of preaching is catechesis. Okay, now that I believe the gospel, does it match my behavior? And here the lens tends to be like a prescription set of glasses, because everyone is a different individual. Everyone's life situation is different. How do I respond to the call of Christ, to the demands of the gospel in my own particular situation? Then the third type of preaching, theological argument, it's more like a microscope or a telescope. It's a finely ground lens, a specifically ground lens, so that the group, this class, your parish, can look at a particular issue, say through the lens of Catholic social teaching, and say, okay, this is how we are to understand the issue out there of euthanasia, of abortion, of poverty, of migration. So that's another kind, and that tends to be very analytical, and you come, and it's got evidence, and you can come to a conclusion. So it has to do with thinking, and it's a group lens. Okay, so what does the lens become at the Mass in a liturgical setting? It flips into a mirror, so that people look at this mirror and they say, "Oh, here is God walking at our side. Here's the Lord in our midst. Here's the Lord calling our young people to follow Him. Here's the Lord at the bedside of our elderly, giving them comfort and hope. Here's the Lord in the neonatal care unit, comforting the parents, helping them to have hope." So you begin to the homilist is he serves the people best by keeping his eye peeled for God, and then finding the places where in their life it overlaps with the story of God in the Scriptures. And personally, I just find that to be tremendously invigorating.
Yes.
and it leads me to just do a lot of contemplating.
That language of contemplation, and again, you and I have spoken many times about your own approach to preaching, and even when I read your collections of homilies that you have out there, which I'll make sure I have you remind everyone at the end what those are so they can get them. Because they're examples. They're great examples, though, of the connection between your own prayer life, your own approach to prayer, your approach to preaching, and then your approach to pastoral care and being with your people, all kind of playing together. So maybe you could speak about that relationship among those.
Yeah, well, a very early influence in my formation was making an Ignatian retreat. And having been a daydreamer all my life, I found that really easy to do composition of place. Imagine the scene, put myself in there, and then of course when I was ordained, it was very easy to imagine those scenes of the gospel in terms of my parish and the lives of my parishioners, and to invite them along into the scene. And actually, that's one of the most enjoyable parts of preaching for me is finding those serendipitous, unexpected connections that start to open up the scriptures from the vantage point, from things that are familiar, that from the nooks and crannies of day-to-day life in the homes and workplaces and commuting of your people. For example, I remember one Lent we had terrible grass fires all across the high plains of the Texas Panhandle, which is my diocese. Over 1 million acres were destroyed, and I remember reading an article in the newspaper about this firefighter who was also a rancher. He was a volunteer firefighter, and how he spent the entire night out trying to put out on the prairie, trying to put out fires, trying to save the homes and the cattle and the horses of his neighbors, and coming home to find out that his own horses had been killed in the fire. Well, anyway, that was the situation. But it was Ash Wednesday was coming up, so for my people on that particular Lent. The season did not begin with ash on the forehead. It began with soot on the ground. And to talk about this man, his dedication, and to go from that to the demands of Lent, to sacrifice, to put your life on the line for those you love. So those kind of connections, they're all over the place. And once you develop a good eye to see them, they become obvious. But I've also have found that that's where the people make the connection in the homily. They'll comment that the homilies that I'll get the most comments on have the most connections. Most vivid, factual, practical connections.
Yes,
with the stories of the people.
And you know what really comes to mind, Father, as you speak like that is, so as you described that, the fire, the firefighter, the ashes on the ground, Ash Wednesday, it created a whole world for me in my mind. I could picture the world differently. I could think of a fire differently than I did before. And it makes me think of the power that language has to create reality almost for people, to open up a world they could never have inhabited unless you had created that world space for them from your language.
I'm glad you brought that up, Tom, because that's a key difference when we're talking about like delivery and, you got content, but you also have delivery. And if you're preaching from the standpoint of an expert or a theologian, like in theological argument, or that of a teacher or coach in catechesis, you step back and your language tends to be a bit analytical, a bit distant. But again, think about that coach in the middle of the game. Your language and the way you speak is going to be immediate. And some people call this frontier language as opposed to the language of the settlement. The language of the settlement is that which is clear. It's the kind of language you use when you go to town and you're dealing with things like paying money. Well, okay, you got to be really specific. This product costs this much. Everything's very specific and orderly. But frontier language takes us places where we've not been before. That's why it's called the frontier. And the language you're kind of reaching, you're kind of grasp me. Okay, what am I trying to get across here? Just recently, I gave a homily that might illustrate this well. My goal was to help enhance the people's experience of the Mass as something happening right here, right now. Here's the Lord in our midst. So I used the example of a young man I knew some years ago from my hometown who, when he was 18, he had a diving accident and was paralyzed from the chest down. But Tony was just this amazing guy. He ended up learning how to drive. He ended up taking a full-time job at a local factory. And if that wasn't enough, he eventually learned to fly an ultralight aircraft. go to this town on a summer weekend. There'd be a chance you see this ultralight up, and there'd be Tony. This paralyzed guy looking down on the town he loved, looking down at that runway. And next to it, his wheelchair, empty, without him in it. He was going any place he wanted to go. An amazing guy. Okay, so I said, when and this is where that the power of narrative comes in, especially in Catholic preaching. If we have the courage to put ourselves vicariously, even a few moments, next to Tony in his darkest moment, this is what draws us to amazing people like this. If we can be with them in their moment of darkness, we'll also be with them when the light breaks in. And that's exactly what happens at the Mass. People call that victory. We call it the Mass because we're right next. We get the courage to stand not next to a young man and paralyzed from the chest down, but our Savior paralyzed from the neck down. He's nailed to it. He can't move.
Wow.
But through that all, we are with him, and he doesn't give up. He overcomes. He's in excruciating pain, but he conquers. And eventually he rises from the dead and ascends into heaven. And then, like Tony, he says, "Hey, come follow me. Come up here. Look at how beautiful it all looks from up here." And he invites us to leave our fears behind and learn how to fly. So, when you can play with these kind of concepts and these kind of correlations between our life and the story of the gospel. That's an example of what I would call frontier language. It takes us to places where you don't expect. I mean, even as you're preparing it, you find yourself being led. Well, where did that come from? You have that sense of the muse saying, "Oh, this is fascinating. Let's go with this. This looks exciting. Let's explore this a little bit." So it's very, very different process than dialectic analysis, coming to conclusions. I mean, that has its place. It's important. We need that kind of preaching. We need all kinds of preaching. But at the Mass, and it doesn't mean that you don't teach at the Mass. It doesn't mean that you aren't clear at the Mass. This just means that the primary strategy tends to be description, story, action, encounter. That's what you're aiming for. Not conclusion, but recognition. Oh, I know that guy. His name's Jesus. He's my pal.
Father Jim here came and visited Pensacola and gave a day of reflection to the priests of our diocese here a number of months ago. Father Jim, we were so grateful to have you. And one of the blessings of that was that my wife Patty and I got to host him for dinner one night with Father Dustin Fedden from our diocese, and
it was a good dinner.
It was a wonderful dinner. She is a great cook, but the conversation was so wonderful. All of us together, and then you and Father Dustin. And when you left, you all left that night, went back to where you're staying. My wife Patty said to me, "Father Jim is full of wonder. He's like a child. He's full of wonder." And I said, that's it. You are. And when I would teach the seminarians in a particular class I had at their very last semester of seminary, I would say to them at the end, I give them some pieces of advice, and I'd say one of the things I asked them to be, and this is one of the reasons I fell in love with your writing when you first sent it to me years ago. I said to them that you must become architects of wonder who build places for people to inhabit that help them to wonder again, to see the world in an entirely new way they'd never had before. And this is the gift that you're talking about here, this frontiers of language, this capacity to open up and to intersect between God's story and our story. So maybe a little more focus on how do you sharpen and maintain as a preacher this focus on the overlaps between God's story, our story, and then opening up that world of intersection?
Well, for me, since I don't know why I'm just kind of drawn to observe and try to see what's going on behind the scenes or beneath the surface. I've just always found that very fascinating, and because that's where God so often shows up. It's just like, oh, okay, now I see what you're doing, Lord. Oh, now I see your footprints on this piece of sand, your fingerprints on this particular vessel that you're shaping, and to find ways to express that kind of sacredness of life. So for me, what I've done is I make it a goal. Life's full of wonders, and obviously it's full of details and drudgery and routine. But if you can see the amazing things. By the way, there's a school bell. Excuse me.
Well, I think the last time we recorded this, you had school bells. It's so perfect. It's illustrating your point, is it not?
But there have been times when I have when I went from a rural parish to an urban parish, I found myself a bit thrown off balance, because in a rural parish, you know everybody and you know what everybody does, and in this. It was actually a suburban parish in Cincinnati, Ohio, and wonderful people. But I always had to ask them, what do you do for a living? Nobody would talk about what they did for their work. They'd talk about their kids. They'd talk about the Bengals and the Reds, but they wouldn't talk about what they did. So I started this program called Take Your Pastor to Work. And man, it was that popular. It was one of the best things I ever did. I got to go to all the, if they could have somebody, if their boss allowed them to bring somebody along to shout at them for an hour or two, or join them in the lunchroom. I just got to know my people so much better. And actually, they were pretty, they were all like really pleased that somebody was interested in what they did day after day. But, I'd ask them, or I'd be keeping an eye out for, how is God present in their life? And sometimes I'd ask them directly, and I can still remember this many years ago. I still remember some just very poignant moments. I remember this one nurse in a pathology lab. She said, "Well, Father, my job is to count blood corpuscles on these slides of blood samples, and every once in a while I realize that the person from whom the sample has been taken has cancer, has leukemia, and at that moment I'm the only one in the world that knows." And she said to me, I always say a prayer at that moment, because in a short time this person's life is going to change very dramatically. And so she would bring her faith into the life of her work. And this would happen over and over again. I remember being with a guard at a juvenile detention center. I didn't know they had such things. They're like prisons for teenagers. So in the guard posts, there's this thick glass between them and these kids down in the day room below. But taped to the edge of the window were all of these photographs of kids at birthday parties on the beach, Christmas morning. And I asked him, I said, who are these your kids? He said, yeah, we guards, we do that. We bring pictures from home and tape them on the wall to remind us that the kids down there are just like our kids at home. They're kids. And then I couldn't help but think of that phrase from the scripture, living stones. We're all living stones in the house of God. So yeah, it was a very wonderful time. It strengthened my connection with the parishioners. I just got to know them on a whole other level. It was just very rewarding, very rewarding. In fact, I wrote a book on it. It's called "Preacher in a Hard Hat." So, but it's written a long time ago. So I would definitely redo some sentences this time around. But if they want to take a look at one of my preaching books, that would be one of them. "Preacher in a Hard Hat."
Preacher in a Hard Hat. And then there's another one. You have a number of books, but Preacher at a Truck Stop.
Oh yeah,
Preaching at a Truck Stop.
Yeah.
Can I ask just at a random? Can I ask where that title came from?
I'm a big fan of Saint Catherine of Siena, and the title came from through her inspiration. She often talked about the church as a way station, as a hostel, a place where travelers stop to get refreshed, to rest, and then move on their journey. And so today that would be, of course, a truck stop. And, so it's a reminder to me, when I do pull into a truck stop, sometimes I try to imagine St. Catherine behind the counter. Well, this is how we travel these days. And it's a way to correlate the tradition of the church, the teaching of the church, with contemporary experiences and symbols and things that we encounter day after day.
Lovely. And yet another example of the way that you pray, take experience from life and then overlap it with the story of God himself. Right. So an ecclesiology, an understanding of the church emerges from a truck stop. I mean, that's just a really rich way of helping people concretize these abstract ideas that we often have in theology that are hard to grasp until you bring them to reality. So I really appreciate that so much, the way you do that. So,
I need to give a little bit of credit to a spiritual director I had many years ago. He had a lot of influence on me in many ways. But one of the things that I always remember him saying was, look for the grace, Jim. Look for the grace. Sometimes grace is hard to see. I'd come in spitting nails upset about something. Jim, where's the grace? And what I found was when you start looking for the grace, it starts showing up all over the place. You train your eye, see the grace in the good times, the bad times, the wonderful things, the confusing things. And then as a homilist, when you can start to put that into words for the people, they begin to see the grace around them in their life too. At least that's my goal.
Yes. One population in your diocese and throughout the United States is the Hispanic community, which obviously is a very diverse community. It's not a single culture and even language. So do you have any examples of preaching in Hispanic communities out of that experience?
Well, this is 80% of my diocese here in the Panhandle, Texas is Hispanic. And my background is German.
But you've adapted astoundingly well.
They certainly a lot more physically expressive. You gotta get used to getting a hug.
No hugs from the Germans, that's right.
They're such wonderful people. And one of the things I often do, I've done this throughout my career, occasionally for lunch or Advent, I'll have homily reflection groups, and we'll read the gospel a few days before the weekend, and then I ask them, okay, what does this bring up in your life? What does it remind you of? What engages you about these words? And that's just really, really helpful. And now that I'm retired from parish administration, I'm the only priest available to fill in for my brother priest. We're just very short-handed out here. My diocese is the size of West Virginia, so I put a lot of miles on my truck. But I go up on Fridays rather than Saturdays, and I always ask the pastor or the deacon if they would, to please gather a small group of parishioners, kind of as a focus group, you might say, And we reflect on the scriptures, and that is so helpful. It's so helpful, especially for me, not being Hispanic, not coming from that background. I learned so much about. Just one small example. Last year, we were talking about the Watchman. It was during Advent, but their word for watchman had a whole different connotation. It was someone who watches through the night, and that's included. But for them, that was paramount. That you're watching through the darkness of the night, and that had not occurred to me. Or in another parish, they're talking about how, because actually in a lot of our small towns, you have wave migration. Families come and join the family members to help them get started. And so, like, you'll have one town where most of the people come from Michoacan, or another town where the majority come from Chihuahua. But in this particular town, I found out they were from many, many different parts of Mexico, as well as other parts of Central America. And so that was a real benefit. They were telling me about how much that forced them and encouraged them to reach out and get to know each other. And that community is very proud of the fact that despite their different national backgrounds, different regional backgrounds within Mexico, and they transcended that, and they found it very enriching, and that became the focus of my homily that weekend. The things you pick up it's a matter of, yes, you preach the biblical text, but you also have to preach the context. It's text and context working together, and the more that you can get into each one of those and somehow connect them, the better your chances are of making connections with your listeners, and they're having a connection with the living Christ, the living Word of God, during that communion service, that liturgy of the Word.
Absolutely. So, do you, maybe as a kind of a final reflection here, tying a lot of this together, so do you have any suggestions for both pastors and parishioners? I mean, this will be a video that's available publicly. I mean, I'm targeting the priest, but as to how to approach, reading and praying the scriptures. You talked about these focus groups before Sunday to really pray over them. And I'm sure that makes much more impactful experience of the liturgy on Sunday if you do that. So any suggestions you have for both those groups?
Well, I guess, getting back to my friend, the Assemblies of God preacher, Bible study is good. It's important. We need to know the Bible and its historical context. But when we're preparing for Sunday liturgy, I think it might be better and more interesting, more engaging for lay people, if they want to engage the Sunday scriptures, get the most out of them, would be to just focus on one of them, usually the gospel, but it can be one of the other two readings as well. And instead of doing Bible study, do story exploration. How does that story does that story remind me of a story in my life, or a story I heard about, and focus on the story rather than the history. Not that Bible study is bad, as I said, that's very important, it's very helpful. But when we're preparing for the liturgy, we're preparing not for a lesson, we're preparing for an encounter. How can I open my heart, my mind to hear the Lord reaching in and saying, "I'm here. Here, look here." It's like when Philip asked the Lord, "Now, where do you live?" He said, "Well, come and see." That's the Lord telling me to come see where I live. Come see how I live with you. So I think for lay people, that might be something to consider. Just if they want to do something different, have lunch and have a really engaging evening with fellow Catholics, neighbors that are and friends that are going to be with them at Mass, that can be really, really deepening and make connections between them and the church, as well as their friendships in their neighborhood. And for pastors, obviously, having been a pastor for 40 years, you don't want to load people down, but occasionally, if you're looking for some fresh start, a little bit of spark in your preaching. Yeah, maybe for Lent, have one or two homily reflection groups. Ask somebody to invite some friends over to their house, and you join them, and you just kind of listen in. Almost always, you're going to get one or two ideas that you're going to want to run with in the homily that weekend. Now, of course, you need to be considerate. You don't want to use personal examples, without people's permission. And you need to use good sense with that. Sometimes I've called people and said, that was a really interesting story about you fixing that lawnmower with your grandson. Do you mind if I use that in the house this weekend? Yeah?
I do that all the time too. Ask permission from people.
So that's one way. Another way sometimes is for the priest or the deacon to have a mindset, not so much of a teacher, but kind of a field reporter. You go through your weekend, you're taking notes on what's happening in the field. How are people responding to issues in the news? How what's going on in the city? How's the football team doing? Just keep your 10A up and take mental notes and bring it with you when you sit down and you read that Sunday homily and you say, okay, Holy Spirit, what are we going to talk about this week?
Yes. Excellent. That's really helpful. And the one last little point or question I'd like to ask is, so in homilies, I've listened to a lot of homilies, and sometimes stories that are used that you get from the week or things like that can be used almost as an opening anecdote that's used to begin it. And then the rest of the homily really has nothing to do with the story. It's just it was a launching pad to get their interest and then move into that. That's a way. How would you, there are lots of ways to do it. How would you say the best way to weave into a homily storytelling or narrative or that kind of thing? How would you describe that in your experience?
Well, it helps if you pay a little bit of attention to how you get their attention. And to get their attention usually means that you're talking something about what they're interested in or what they've experienced. And then from there, you lead them into, you don't use the story as a jumping off point, but you make some kind of connection with them to lead them into the blended story of, things that you're taking from their story, things that you're, like to sit on the ground during that wildfire. And, okay, now we're talking about ashes and we're getting ready for this season of taking a good hard look at our lives and in our community and in our faith. So one little trick that I found, that I discovered years ago, is that the dominant verb tense in homiletic preaching is present. In evangelization, the dominant verb tense is past. Jesus healed the sick. He did this. He did this. He did this. And you're talking about what the Lord did to give them the gospel in the nutshell. The kerygma. In the other two, catechesis and theological argument, the main tense is the future. Okay, this is how I'm going to try to behave. This is how I'm going to act. Or with theological argument, this is how I'm going to think about this. But at the homily, the walls of time fall away. We're at the liturgy. Heaven comes down to earth. It's kairos. Everything is present. Here is the Lord in our midst now. And the more that you find yourself using the present tense, not backing off and analyzing, but talking about what's going on right here, right now in our community, in this sacred place, in this house of God. That would be a way to keep the people engaged, to keep that football coach at the huddle saying, "Okay, we're in the middle of the game, guys. Let's be doing our best." And that those kind of mindsets can kind of in the back of the mind can kind of influence how you approach it, and certainly how you deliver it at the time.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you so much. for all of that. That's a beautiful, comprehensive picture of kind of the world of homilies as you've unfolded it in your own preaching and teaching over the years. I want to throw something here at the end just for a very brief ending, if you don't mind. We didn't talk about this, so I'm going to do something that I just thought of just as we were speaking. There's a story you told me once while I was visiting your home, your ranch, with my daughters in 2020 about I think you invited people to come to your ranch to do some equine therapy, right, with your horses. And there was one particular person who was touching one of the scars on one of your horses. And it was I never forgot it, and it had such an impact on me. And you reflected on it in that moment in terms of its deeper meaning. So would you mind kind of recounting that just as a closing moment of that intersection? Because that was an intersection for me.
Yeah, well, it's a good example of how, for the preacher, when using Father Mark, my former spiritual director's advice, when you look for grace, it starts showing up all over the place. And sometimes it's just astounding. But yeah, I had it was actually a group of recovering addicts. I used to work with this drug court in my last parish, and they'd come over to my corral and we'd do horse therapy. And they found that very interesting. I don't know if that helped them a whole lot, but it was something other than talk therapy that they usually had to go through week after week. But Buddy, Buddy's just about a mile away. My place is just up the open school here. But when I bought Buddy as a young colt, he had this huge scar on his rear flank. And I don't know how it got there, and the guy who owned him at the time didn't know how it got there. But with horses, when they get a scar, they often develop what's called horse flesh. It kind of overlaps, and a scar on a horse is always going to be very obvious. And I can remember we were at the end of this session, this equine therapy session, and one of the women, she loved Buddy, but I noticed her going up to the back of him, and it was just a very poignant moment. She stood there a long time, and she just kept stroking that big scar on his rump, and I couldn't help but think that she was feeling the scars in her own soul and how they're healing over, and how she wanted them to heal over. And of course, it reminded me very much of the Apostle Thomas touching the scar in Jesus' hand and side. The stories are much closer to us than we normally realize, and every once in a while that breaks through. That encounter between the Lord and Thomas isn't simply something in the pages of the Gospel of St. John. It's all around us all the time. All of us with our scars, reaching out to find comfort and healing and the love that the Lord bore us, and evident in His scars. So another book I might recommend is called The Preaching Life by Barbara Brown Taylor, Episcopalian priest, and she talks about how when you are a preacher, you start to look at life very differently. You start to look at it very deeply, and in the depth of it, you begin to discover all kinds of light. It's a wonderful way to live. I wouldn't trade it for the world.
I know you wouldn't. You're the happiest man I've ever met in your vocation. You really are. You've lived. It suits you well, as a bishop I know says about his own vocation. When he was asked to comment on it, he said, "It suits me well all my life, and it suits you well." So thank you so much, Father Jim, for bringing yourself, your expertise.
Well, thanks for this opportunity, Tom.
Oh, such a joy! It's just to see your face is a joy, and your smile.
And so is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, God bless you abundantly, and thank you for sharing with the priests of our diocese and, of course, the faithful who also listen.
You're all in my prayers. You keep up the good work, Tom. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. God bless you. This has been another edition of Sharing the Faith with priests. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll be presenting more of these in the future for priests, and God bless you abundantly.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Sharing the Faith podcast. If you would like to learn more about the podcast, visit ptdiocese.org/sharingthefaith. If you listen to the audio version through an app such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, or iHeartRadio, be sure to rate, review, and comment. If you watched on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe or leave a comment on the episode. Thank you for listening.